So we as consumers, when we buy this stuff from these very poor countries, we can try to put pressure, so we can try to buy stuff where there's some sort of certification. So you know that this was not produced in some factory in Bangladesh where people are working 12 hours a day, non-stop. But if you're not willing to make that effort to kind of make sure that everything that you buy was produced with decent labour conditions, then you have to accept that the low cost is just what allows many people to buy a lot of stuff. Yeah, and higher prices would reflect higher costs, better pay, and so on, would clearly reduce quantities very substantially. Okay, I gave you a really nice reading, I think, about it. So 2 readings, one by Krugman and another one by John Miller, about this idea, these misconceptions, and should we try to pay these people higher wages and so on. And what I'm telling you is that, as always, there are pros and cons in doing these things. So it's about your principles, really. Are you willing to sacrifice a lower quantity of imports and guarantee that the people that are producing get high wages or not? Yeah, so it's a difficult job. Okay, now, so to come back to the diagram, so we're going to do this now with relative wages. So that's why I wrote in here, revisiting the two-country, two-good, one-factor model, and relative wages on top. So if you remember, I was kind of assuming that home was in England and foreign was France. And I was saying that foreign is more productive in both cloth and food. So as you can see, remember, A is the number of hours needed to produce 1 unit of the good. So A for foreign in cloth is half of the labour requirements at home, and it's 1/3 for the case of for food. Yeah. So home is more productive in both goods, but it's relatively more productive in food. Yeah, and so this means that one can basically specialise as long as the relative wage that home workers get compared to foreign workers is going to be between those two relative productivities. So that's what we're going to get. We're again going to get a step sort of relative demand, where if the wage is too high, everyone would buy from one country. If the wage is too low, everyone would buy from the other country. And in between, there's going to be benefits from trade and specialisation. So we introduce this letter. AZ is just home's relative productivity. And as you can see, it's just a ratio of average products of labour, because with one factor, the inverse of the hours needed is effectively productivity. In other words, if I need 5 hours, so this is AZ, at home to produce a unit of goods Z, then in 1 hour, I'm going to produce 1/5, so 1/5 of a good. Yeah? So AZ is nothing but home's relative productivity in good Z. So what we now do is think of, rather than having subscripts C, F, and I, and so on, we'll just have these brackets. So Z is just a good, and what you see is that we're going to go from a very unrealistic setting of two goods to a setting where you really have a continuum of goods. So people, even us, we buy literally tens of thousands of goods over our lives. So they're very, very different things. Just food items are very varied, and this means that it makes sense to try to extend these lessons to models with many, many goods. So AZ, home's relative productivity. So home's relative productivity is obviously less than 1, because we assumed foreign price was better producing both. And so it's half for C, it's 1/3 for F. And what we said was that in equilibrium, there's going to be specialization, and this must mean that home, even though it's in absolute terms worse at producing both, it's still going to be able to produce one of the goods, so cloth, at a lower cost. Why? Because the wages that home gets relative to foreign are going to be lower than its relative productivity. So this is what we now are going to see in figure 6. So rather than having the relative price on the vertical axis, we have home's relative wage. And on the horizontal axis, instead of having quantities, we really have just the index of the goods. And so here it goes. So this will make a lot more sense once you have a continuum of goods. So we're just indexing the goods, and in this case, there are only 2 goods, so you go from no goods at all to good C, cloth, and then to good F. And so there are only 2 possibilities. This is the relative productivity at home in cloth and the relative productivity in food. So if the relative wage at home, so W, its wage relative to foreign, is too high, then, and so effectively higher than its relative productivity in cloth, then home would not be able to produce anything because foreign would always be able to produce stuff at a lower cost. Yeah? However, once the real wage is just equal to its relative productivity, my example before with the poor country and so on, it was when your relative wage is it's just equal to 1/10 of the wages of the rich country, then you're going to be able to produce that first good at the same cost as the foreign country. And so that's why the amount produced could be anything between 0 and the total supply of cloth of cloth for the economy. Yeah. Then you have once the wage drops below your relative productivity in cloth, you will actually definitely specialize in cloth making. Why? Because as you can see, your relative wage is lower than your relative productivity. In other words, you compensate low productivity by even lower relative wages, and hence your cost is lower. Yeah? And exactly the same logic in here. Once your wage has dropped below your F is your relative productivity in F, and it's sort of the good that you produce less well in comparative terms. So if, it's not going to happen, but if your wage were to be equal to your relative productivity in F, then you would actually be able to produce the good at the same cost as foreign. And so that's why the supply could be anything between nothing and the full supply of the good in the market. And then, of course, if your wage was so low that it was even lower than your worst relative productivity, you would end up by producing everything. So, as you can see, what we get is, on the horizontal axis, an index of goods. You start at 0, and you finish with the maximum number of goods, in this case just 2. And every time you move to the right, it means that home is producing more of the goods. If you move to the left, it means that foreign will be producing more of the goods. And so it is very useful now to go from this to many goods and then a continuum of goods and examples. So this is what we're going to have next. I've explained this, and the only thing I haven't mentioned is that RS. So we're going to have, we still don't know where that relative wage comes from. And of course, the relative wage is going to come from the interaction of supply and demand in the economy as a whole. And that's why we need a so-called general equilibrium perspective. So the wages are going to be determined by how much a country is able to produce. If I have a lot of wages, high wages and I trade, it must mean that I'm selling a lot of goods. Yeah? If my wages are very low, it must mean that I'm not able to sell a lot, because income is always equal to expenditure, always equal to output. This is remember that basic identity you were taught in first year math. Income equals expenditure equals GDP. What we're saying is that low income is going to reflect a low profit, and high income is going to reflect a big production. So you have that upward sloping relative supply curve, and it's the intersection of the stepwise relative demand curve and that relative supply that is going to tell us which goods will be produced by home and which goods are produced by foreign. So many goods. So what we are now thinking about, rather than thinking in terms of two silly goods or two categories, cloth and food, so primary commodities in industry, what we're trying to look at is to be more realistic and say it may well be that home is not great at producing 90% of the primary commodities, but it's going to be able to produce 10% of those primary commodities really well. So what matters is to kind of really look at relative productivity across many, many sectors. And when we go for a continuum of goods, it's kind of it means that we can separate the categories of goods as thinly as possible. And it's really not just going to be a banana. It might be a banana with a certain category. So, for example, very big ones or small ones, or very yellow and so on. So, and what we now say is there's potentially each country would be able to produce all of those goods. But their productivities are going to vary a lot from one sector, from one good to the other. And you can, conceptually at least, rank the goods that home could produce from high productivity to low productivity compared to foreign. And that ranking is given by that index AZ. So A, remember, is home's relative productivity in good Z. So a high A means that you're highly productive in producing in production of that good compared to foreign. A low A means the opposite. If that A is equal to 1, it means you have exactly the same productivity. Yeah? So every time A is equal to 1, it would mean that you would need exactly the same number of hours to produce that good at home that you need in the foreign country or countries. Yeah? So the lower index goods will be goods where your home is relatively good at. The high index goods will be goods that home is relatively bad at producing. And what we have is exactly the same sort of step relatively more than before. So this is saying we now have, rather than just 2 goods, cloth and food, we have 4 goods. And so potentially, and so